On the morning of the 30th of April, 1975, a North Vietnamese tank smashed straight through the iron gates of the presidential palace in the center of Saigon and rolled to a halt on the grass beyond. The men who climbed out of it and ran up the steps to raise their flag had spent years getting to that lawn. Some of them wore sandals cut from old truck tires. Many had walked hundreds of miles down jungle paths to be there. And while they planted their flag over the palace, on rooftops across the same city, American helicopters were clattering up into the sky, crammed with the last of the Americans and the South Vietnamese who had staked their lives on them, lifting away over the coast toward the ships waiting at sea. Some of the people who could not get a seat clung to the landing skids as the machines rose. By that afternoon, it was finished. Vietnam was one country again, ruled from Hanoi, and the strongest armed force the world had ever produced had lost a war to an enemy that began the fight with next to nothing. The numbers behind that morning are almost hard to believe. Across the course of the war, the United States dropped more than 3 times the weight of bombs on Vietnam and its neighbors that American forces had dropped in the whole of the Second World War, on every front, against Germany and Japan combined. They sprayed 19 million gallons of chemicals over the forests to kill the leaves the enemy sheltered beneath. At the height of it, they had more than 500,000 troops in the country, backed by the wealth of the richest nation on earth, by total command of the sky, by helicopters and heavy artillery, and the largest navy in the world. The other side had rifles, mortars, bicycles, shovels, and a willingness to die in numbers that the Americans never came close to matching. By every measure, an army is usually judged by. It was one of the most lopsided contests imaginable, and the side with almost nothing won. The beginning of all this was not American, and it lay almost 30 years before that tank reached the palace, with a different Western army that came to Vietnam certain of victory and learned, the hard way, the lesson the Americans would later refuse to learn from them. For most of a century, Vietnam had belonged to France, one piece of a colonial empire in Southeast Asia. During the Second World War, the Japanese occupied it, and when they were defeated, a Vietnamese independence movement, led by a thin, soft-spoken revolutionary named Ho Chi Minh, declared the country free. France had no intention of letting it go. In 1946, the two sides went to war, and early in that war, Ho said something to the French that they ought to have nailed to the wall of every ministry in Paris. He told them that they could kill 10 of his men for every one of theirs that his men killed, and that even at those odds, in the end, it would be the French who grew tired of it first. The French did not believe him. They were a professional European army facing what they regarded as peasants. They were wrong in the one way that mattered. The man who proved it was Ho's military commander, Vo Nguyen Giap, a former history teacher with no formal training as a soldier. In the spring of 1954, the French tried to draw Giap into a stand-up battle by planting a strong garrison in a remote valley in the northwest called Dien Bien Phu, ringed by high jungle hills. The French were confident because everyone agreed that an army of guerrillas could never haul heavy artillery up through that kind of country, and without guns on the heights, the valley was safe. Giap took the heavy guns apart, and his soldiers carried them up the back slopes of those hills piece by piece, on their shoulders and on bicycles, through the jungle, and put them back together looking straight down into the French camp. Then he opened fire. The airstrip was wrecked, the garrison was cut off, and for 56 days, Giap's men dug their trenches closer and closer, while the trapped French were slowly ground down. On the 7th of May, the garrison surrendered. It was the end of French rule in Vietnam, and it had been delivered by exactly the kind of enemy the French had been so sure could never beat them. At a conference in Geneva later that year, Vietnam was cut in two along a line near its middle, the 17th parallel. The North became a communist state under Ho Chi Minh, run from Hanoi. The South became a separate state backed by the West, run from Saigon. The split was meant to be temporary, settled by national elections within 2 years. Those elections were never held because the side that expected to lose them refused to allow them. And so there were 2 Vietnams. One, determined to unite the whole country under Hanoi by whatever means it took, and one propped up from outside to stop precisely that. Into that gap, slowly at first and then all at once, stepped the United States. The Americans did not come to Vietnam because they cared a great deal about Vietnam. They came because of a fear that ran through the whole Cold War. The belief that if one country in a region fell to communism, its neighbors would topple one after another like a row of dominoes, and that stopping it anywhere meant stopping it everywhere. So Washington poured money and weapons into the government in Saigon, and then military advisors, and then more advisors. The trouble was that the government they were propping up was corrupt, unpopular, and unstable, more interested in surviving its own people than in fighting the North, and no amount of American support ever quite fixed that. The rot underneath the whole effort was there from the very start. In August of 1964 came the moment that opened the door to a full American war. United States destroyers off the coast of North Vietnam reported that they had been attacked. A first clash had certainly happened. A second, 2 days later, almost certainly had not. And within a few years, it was widely accepted that the second attack was a phantom, a tangle of bad weather and jumpy radar operators. None of that mattered at the time. President Lyndon Johnson carried the reports to Congress, which voted him sweeping authority to use force, and the slide into a major war began. In March of 1965, the first American combat troops, a brigade of Marines, waded ashore at Da Nang. Behind them came a flood. Within 3 years, there were more than 500,000 American servicemen in the country, and the bombers were flying north in a campaign that would grind on for years. The machine the Americans brought to Vietnam was built to smash another machine like itself, to win the kind of war that had been won against Germany, with massed firepower hammering a clearly marked enemy across a clearly marked front. In Vietnam, there was no front. The enemy the Americans had come to destroy mostly refused to line up and be destroyed. Much of the fighting in the South was done by the Viet Cong, local guerrillas who lived among the ordinary villagers and looked exactly like them, a farmer with a hoe by day and a fighter with a rifle by night. They struck from ambush, sowed the trails with homemade traps, and were gone before the Americans could bring their enormous firepower to bear. A patrol would walk into a quiet village and find nothing but women and children and old men, and a mile down the track, it would be torn apart by people who, minutes before, had seemed to be those same villagers, and who had melted back into the fields by the time the helicopters came overhead. Beneath the ground, there were tunnels, miles upon miles of them, dug by hand over years, with sleeping quarters and kitchens and hospitals and command posts buried deep enough to ride out the bombing, so that ground the Americans had declared cleared was alive with the enemy again the moment they left it. Running down through the neighboring countries of Laos and Cambodia was a vast web of paths and roads called the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the supply line that kept the war in the South fed with men and weapons from the North. The Americans bombed that trail without mercy, year after year, and the North Vietnamese simply repaired it and widened it and kept the trucks and the porters moving, filling the craters by hand, walking the same paths over the bones of the ones who had walked them before. So the Americans did the thing their power made possible. If they could not find a front, they would manufacture one out of firepower. They flew patrols out by helicopter to locate the enemy, pin him in place, and then call down artillery and airstrikes to wipe him out, an approach they called search and destroy. When it worked, it killed the enemy in great numbers, but it almost never held anything. The Americans would fight a hard battle for a hill or a stretch of jungle, take it, count the enemy dead, and then fly away. Because holding every hill in the country was impossible. And the enemy would come back, because for him, there was nowhere else to go. This was his country. He was not going home at the end of a tour, because he was already home. That last difference was the whole war, and the Americans were slow to understand it. They and their enemy were not fighting the same kind of war at all. For the United States, Vietnam was a limited war, one contest among many in a global struggle, fought 8,000 miles from home over a country most Americans could not have found on a map, for stakes that did not include the survival of the United States itself. American patience for it had a bottom, and everyone in Hanoi understood that, for the North Vietnamese, the war was not one contest among many. It was the only thing. It was their own land, their own independence, the joining together of their own divided nation. And they were ready to fight for it, not for a few years, but for as long as it took, across an entire generation, if that was the price, and to spend lives at a rate no Western country would ever accept. The American general in command through the crucial years, William Westmoreland, built his whole strategy around firepower and a single grim measurement: he would win by attrition. He would use America's vast advantage in weapons to kill the enemy faster than the enemy could replace his losses, until at last too few of them were left to keep fighting. The books for that strategy were kept in a number that came to define the war and to poison it: the body count. The flaw in it was the same flaw Ho Chi Minh had named to the French 20 years earlier. It only worked if the enemy reached a point where the dying became unbearable, and he gave up. The North Vietnamese never reached that point. Ho had said that if the Americans wanted to fight for 20 years, then Vietnam would fight for 20 years, and he meant it precisely. You cannot bleed an enemy into surrender when he has already decided that he will bleed for as long as it takes. The pattern had shown itself in the very first major battle between the two regular armies, back in the autumn of 1965, in a remote valley called the Ia Drang. For the first time, a large force of North Vietnamese regulars and a large force of Americans met head-on, and the Americans fought it in a way no army ever had, swinging whole companies into and out of the fight by helicopter, pounding the enemy with artillery and aircraft, and, in close support of ground troops for the first time, the giant B-52 bombers. They killed North Vietnamese soldiers in great heaps. What the American commanders carried away from it was that their firepower could win the war. What the North Vietnamese carried away from it was that if they grabbed the Americans by the belt, got in so close that the bombs and the shells could not fall without killing Americans too, they could stand and trade blood at close range and survive. Both sides called it a victory. Only one of them had learned the more useful thing. Before the part of the story where all of this came to a head, a quick word. If you are getting something out of the way this channel takes a strategy apart, the simplest way to help is to subscribe and to give the video a like. It takes a second, and it makes a real difference to whether these stories reach anyone at all. That done, back to the war and to the winter when the Americans believed they were finally winning it. By the end of 1967, after years of fighting and dying, the message coming out of the American command was that the corner had been turned. Westmoreland told audiences that he could see the light at the end of the tunnel, that the enemy was being worn down, that the worst was behind them. The president said much the same. The official picture was of a beaten foe who could manage nothing more than small ambushes in the far corners of the country, an enemy on his last legs. It was into that confidence, on the last night of January 1968, during the truce that traditionally marked the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, the holiday called Tet, that the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong launched the largest and most shocking offensive of the entire war. They came everywhere at once, Around 80,000 communist fighters attacked more than 100 cities and towns across the south in a single coordinated blow, hitting places that were supposed to be deep in safe territory. In Saigon, a Viet Cong squad blasted its way into the grounds of the United States Embassy itself, the very symbol of American power in the country, and held part of it for hours while the fighting was filmed and flashed around the world. The shock of that alone, enemy soldiers loose inside the American embassy, was enormous. But the worst of it was at Hue, the old imperial capital, a city of palaces and temples on a river in the center of the country. At Hue, the communists did not raid and vanish. They took the city and held it, and it cost the Americans and the South Vietnamese almost a month of the bloodiest fighting of the whole war to take it back, street by street and house by house, calling airstrikes and naval guns down onto the ancient walls. While the communists held the city, their forces and their political officers hunted down and killed thousands of people they had marked as enemies. Officials and teachers and priests and ordinary citizens tied to the southern government and buried them in mass graves that were uncovered afterward. By the time Hue was retaken, it was a ruin. That kind of horror did not belong to one side. A war with no front, fought against an enemy who looked exactly like the civilians all around him. War at the men sent to fight it, until some of them broke in terrible ways. Only weeks after Tet, in a hamlet known as My Lai, a company of American soldiers murdered several hundred unarmed villagers, most of them women and children and old men, in the space of a few hours. It was the worst single atrocity American troops committed in the war. And when the truth of it came out a year later, it poured more poison into an already bitter and divided country back home. By the only measures Westmoreland believed in, Tet was a catastrophe for the communists. They had thrown their forces into the open, and the Americans had cut them to pieces. They had failed to hold almost anything they had seized. The Viet Cong, the southern guerrillas, came out of it gutted, so badly mauled that for the rest of the war the weight of the fighting fell more and more on the regular army of the North. The popular uprising the communists had hoped to set off across the South never happened. On the battlefield, by the numbers, the Americans had won, and won heavily. It did not matter in the slightest. For 3 years the American public had been told that the enemy was nearly finished. And then they switched on their televisions and watched that supposedly finished enemy attack 100 cities at once and fight inside the American embassy. The gap between what they had been promised and what they were now seeing broke something. The most trusted news broadcaster in the country told his viewers that the war looked to be a stalemate that could not be won. Support drained away. Within 2 months, a shaken President Johnson went on television, announced that he was halting much of the bombing to seek peace talks, and said that he would not run for re-election. He had lost the war that counted most, the one for the patience of his own people, and he had lost it in the very weeks his generals were standing over their largest pile of enemy dead. The North had lost the battle and won the war because the only thing it had ever truly needed to defeat was American will, and at Tet it had finally defeated it. The emptiness of it went deeper than the headlines. At the very same time as Tet, the North Vietnamese had laid siege to a lonely marine base called Khe Sanh, up near the border, and Westmoreland became almost fixated on it, terrified of a second Dien Bien Phu, of Americans being overrun in a remote valley the way the French had been. He poured in air power on a scale never seen before. Tens of thousands of tons of bombs dropped around that single base, and the Marines held. They held through months of shelling and assault, and it was trumpeted as a triumph of American firepower and grit. And then, only a few months after the siege was lifted, the Americans quietly packed up and abandoned the base, having decided it was not worth holding after all. They had won it, and then they walked away from it, and before long the enemy walked back in. After Tet, The question in Washington quietly stopped being how to win the war and became how to get out of it without admitting defeat. A new president, Richard Nixon, came in promising peace and set about handing the fighting back to the South Vietnamese army while pulling American troops out, a process given the clumsy name of Vietnamization. The idea was that the South could be built up to hold the line on its own, but the withdrawal and a harder bombing campaign were pursued at the same time. The war was widened into Cambodia and Laos to strike the supply trails and the enemy's safe havens, and the bombing of the North reached new heights of fury. None of it changed the basic arithmetic of the thing. At home, the country the war was being fought for was tearing itself apart over it. The draft sent young men who did not want to go to fight a war that fewer and fewer of them believed in. Protest spread across the universities and out into the streets. In 1971, a secret official history of the war was leaked to the newspapers, the Pentagon Papers, and it laid out in the government's own words how the public had been misled about the war for years. Out in Vietnam, the American army itself, worn down and knowing it was being withdrawn, began to come apart from within, full of men with no wish to be the last to die for a war that was already being abandoned. Early in 1973, a peace agreement was signed in Paris, and the last American combat troops went home. The longest war in the country's history, up to that time, was over for the Americans. It was not over for the Vietnamese. For 2 more years, the two Vietnams fought on without the Americans on the ground. The South, for all the equipment left behind, was hollow, its army badly led and its government rotten, propped upright for years mainly by American power that was now gone. In the spring of 1975, the North launched a full conventional offensive, tanks and divisions driving south, and the Southern Army, which had never been built to stand on its own, fell apart with shocking speed. City after city went. Refugees clogged the roads, and at the end of April, the tanks reached Saigon, and one of them drove through the gates of the presidential palace. And the war that had begun against the French almost 30 years before was over at last. The bill for it is staggering, and it falls in wildly different amounts on the two sides, which is the heart of the whole matter. The United States lost around 58,000 dead, names that now fill a long black wall of polished stone in Washington, and then it went home, across an ocean, to a country that had never once been touched by an enemy soldier. Vietnam did not go home. Vietnam was home. More than 1 million fighters of the North and the Viet Cong were killed. The army of the South lost perhaps 250,000 more, and the number of Vietnamese civilians killed across both halves of the country runs, by most serious estimates, well into the millions. The land itself was cratered and poisoned for a generation. The side that won paid a price for winning, that the side that lost would never have been willing to pay. That was not a weakness in their position. That was their position. A few days before Saigon fell, an American colonel named Harry Summers, in Hanoi as part of a negotiating team, found himself in conversation with a North Vietnamese colonel named Tu. Summers, a soldier who had fought in that war and been wounded in it, said something to the other man that was perfectly true and that had been gnawing at the American military for years. He said, "You know, you never defeated us on the battlefield." The North Vietnamese officer considered this for a moment. Then he answered, "That may be so, but it is also irrelevant." In those 2 short sentences is the entire war. The Americans had won the battles, very nearly all of them. They had won Tet. They had held the bases they chose to hold. They had taken every hill they decided to take and killed the enemy in numbers that should, on paper, have settled the matter 10 times over. And none of it had carried them 1 step closer to the only thing that would have counted as winning. A stable and independent South that could stand on its own feet once they left. The enemy had understood from the first day what the Americans took a decade and 58,000 dead to half understand. that this war was never going to be decided by who won the battles. It was going to be decided by who was still standing and still willing when the other side had finally had enough. Not everyone accepts the simple version of this story, and the disagreement is a serious one. Colonel Summers himself, the man on the receiving end of that line in Hanoi, spent a whole book arguing that the war had in fact been winnable, that it was lost not because guerrillas in sandals are unbeatable, but because America fought the wrong war, scattering its strength, chasing local guerrillas when the real enemy was the conventional army of the North, and never bringing its true power to bear on the right target in the right way. Others have argued that the deeper problem was political, that no amount of military skill could hold up a southern government its own people would not fight for. The historians have not settled it, and probably never will. But underneath every version of the argument sits the same hard fact. The Americans had to win, and to win they had to break the enemy's will before their own gave out. The enemy did not have to win. He only had to still be there at the end. This is the strategy of the weak, and it is one of the oldest things in war, far older than Vietnam. A side that cannot win a straight fight stops trying to win the straight fight. It changes the question. It stops asking, how do I beat his army? And starts asking, how do I outlast his patience? It trades space for time, gives up ground it cannot hold, refuses the decisive battle. The strong side is desperate to fight, and makes the war long and shapeless and expensive and endless, until the cost of carrying on grows heavier for the strong than the prize at the end could ever be worth. The strong side measures the war in enemy dead and captured ground, and wins every column of that ledger. The weak side measures it by one thing only, whether it is still in the fight, and as long as the answer is yes, it has not lost. It works because strength and stake are two different things, and they can point in opposite directions. The United States was, by a huge margin, the stronger, but Vietnam, to the Vietnamese, was everything. And Vietnam, to the Americans, was one faraway problem among many. When one side holds all the power and the other side holds all the stake, the side with the stake will pay prices. The side with the power cannot bring itself to imagine. And across a long enough war, that is what decides it. The man with everything to lose and nowhere else to go beats the man with greater strength and somewhere better to be. None of this stays in the jungle. The same shape turns up wherever something small and determined wears down something large and powerful by the simple refusal to break. It is the giant company that crushes a stubborn little rival in every quarterly report and then finds it still there the next year and the year after, still taking customers, because the small firm is fighting for its life while the giant is fighting over one line item among hundreds. It is the side in a long negotiation that wins by caring more and waiting longer, letting the powerful party grow bored and distracted and hungry to be somewhere else. It is, in a quieter way, anyone who has ever outlasted a stronger opponent, not by beating them but by still being there, unmoved, after the stronger one had run out of patience and gone looking for an easier fight. The lesson cuts both ways. If you are the weaker side, the war is not lost just because you keep losing the battles. And your real weapon is not strength but endurance, the plain refusal to go away. And if you are the stronger side, your power is as much a trap as a gift, because it tempts you into a contest of will against someone who has more of it than you do, in a fight that matters far more to them than it ever will to you. Before you bring your full weight down on someone who has nowhere else to go, the question worth asking is not the obvious one. It is not, can I beat them? It is, can I outlast them? Because the side that only has to survive will, more often than anyone expects, bury the side that has to win. The country those men fought over is one nation today, at peace, crowded and busy, full of people born long after the last helicopter lifted off the embassy roof. In Ho Chi Minh City, which is what Saigon is called now, you can walk the grounds of the same palace the tank drove through, and the gates have long since been repaired. Out beyond the old battlefields, farmers work fields that were once cratered by a weight of bombs heavier than anything dropped in the World War before it. Near the places where the Viet Cong once lived underground, visitors pay a small fee to crawl a little way into the widened tunnels and feel, for a minute or two, the dark and the closeness that those people lived inside for years on end. And in Washington, far across the world, the names of the 58,000 are cut into that wall of black stone, and people still come to find a father, or a brother, or a name they half remember, and to lay a hand against the cold surface of it. The men who beat them never had the better army. They never pretended to. They had something the better army could not buy and could not bomb, and in the end could not outlast, which was the willingness to keep going long after everyone expected them to stop. They lost more battles than they could count, and more men than any Western nation alive would have endured, and they won the only thing the whole long war was ever actually about, which was the last day. They were still standing on it. The other side had gone home. If this story made you see that war a little differently than you did before, the kindest thing you can do is press the like button and subscribe so that the next one comes to you when it arrives. There is a great deal more of it on the way. And if you are not ready to stop just yet, you do not have to. There is another video waiting on your screen right now that carries this same thread a good deal further. Start it whenever you like, and I will be there when you do.